This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our homepage. It's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We are counting on you. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and things that we generally like. This week we are welcoming Benjamin Balint. He's an author, translator, a book reviewer. He's taught literature at the Bard College Humanities program at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem in the past, and he's currently a library fellow at the Van Leer Institute. He has published reviews and essays in the Wall Street Journal. His translations have appeared in the New Yorker, and he's the author of 3 books, including the one we'll be discussing today, which is called Kafka's Last Trial, The Case of a Literary Legacy, published by W.W. Norton in 2018, and in 2019 having appeared also in the UK, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Netherlands, and hopefully other places in the future. Sometimes I feel like we're all sort of living in Kafka's last trial, and now I know that I'm not alone. Benjamin Balint, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for having me.
I consider this book to be a literary drama, a personal drama, but first and foremost, a legal drama. What is the basic plot of the legal drama that forms the backbone of this book?
The basic plot begins perhaps in the summer of 2016. So let me just paint the picture for you. I'm sitting in the Supreme Court of Israel, and unlike other Supreme Courts elsewhere, I've been to the Supreme Court in Washington, for example. At this one, it's quite boisterous. And the atmosphere is you have 3 sets of lawyers, you have 3 Supreme Court justices, they're all interrupting each other, they're talking over each other. It was magnificent. What I realized that day at that hearing, which was going to determine the fate of the estate of Max Brod and Franz Kafka, was that the legal hearing was operating on these 2 very different registers of language. On the one hand, there was the purely legalistic on the surface, which had to do with an interpretation of Max Brod's will. But just underneath the surface was a very heavily charged, ideological, even nationalistic layer of language.
What were they arguing about?
And essentially they're arguing about to whom does the Max Brod estate, including the Franz Kafka papers that he had rescued from Prague to Palestine in 1939, where should this estate properly belong? Should it belong at the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem, which of course is mentioned in Max Brod's will, or on the other hand at the equivalent institution in Germany, the German Literary Archive in Marbach? And this is why I say it became ideological, not just the question of the interpretation of a will, but very, very quickly about not just to whom Kafka belongs, which involves is Kafka a Jewish writer or essentially a German writer, but also to what extent can we in Jerusalem say that we are the proper home for diaspora culture? Of course, Kafka, and as the Germans did not hesitate to point out, never stepped foot in Palestine or Israel. He died in 1924 before there was a state. He was not by any stretch a Zionist. So by what right can you claim, as the Israeli side in the dispute did claim, that he belongs somehow to the cultural heritage of the Jewish people?
But he wasn't exactly not a Zionist either.
No, he was quite ambiguous. He was ambivalent about it.
Tell us about his ambivalence.
Well, Max Brod was his closest friend. They had met in university days. And not just his closest friend, but also his promoter, his champion, his agent, you might say. And Max Brod was always trying to recruit Franz Kafka to the Zionist circles of Prague. Kafka always sort of held those circles and those commitments at an arm's length. At the same time, at the end of his life, he studied Hebrew. I myself have been able to flip through his Hebrew vocabulary notebooks, which are now in the National Library in Jerusalem, which are absolutely fascinating documents. He was studying Hebrew with a young 19-year-old woman from Jerusalem named Pua Menzel Ben-Tovim. He had dreamed with his last lover, whose name was Dora Diamant, dreamed of somehow coming to Palestine. Of course, he was dreaming about it precisely, and this is very Kafka, precisely when it was no longer really realistic. He was already very sick with tuberculosis. But he would say things to Dora, who survived the war, like, let's, start a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and I'll be the waiter.
That's because he didn't believe in his writing.
Essentially, yes. Yes, which had to do with how the whole story began, which is, of course, that he instructed Max Brod in 1924 to burn all of his manuscripts unread. And this is the great ethical dilemma that begins the whole story, if you will, because Max Brod had to decide, do I choose literary posterity to save these manuscripts for posterity, as we know that he did, or do I choose to be loyal to the last instructions of my closest friend?
And going back to the legal battle there, it wasn't a case between the National Library of Israel and the literary archives in Marbach. There was a woman, an Israeli woman, who was the daughter of Max Brod's secretary, who kept his estate after his death and refused to divulge it.
Exactly right. So it's, in a sense, and this is why I said there were 3 panels of lawyers in this day in 2016, and essentially you can think of this trial as a triangle of interests. You had Israel represented by the National Library, German literature represented by their archive, and this woman in her 80s at the time named Eva Hoffe, representing herself, representing her family interests or the interests of privacy, if you will. And the reason that she was involved is quite simple. Max Brod saved Kafka's manuscripts in more than one sense. He saved them from Kafka's last wish, the choice not to burn them. He saved them then from the German occupation. So in 1939, Max Brod and his wife leave Prague on the last train that was let out of Czechoslovakia through the Polish border and came with this suitcase stuffed full of Kafka's manuscripts to Tel Aviv. Now, once in Tel Aviv, Max Brod needed help editing this voluminous material, publishing not just the fiction of Kafka, but also, for example, his diaries, the most personal things, his letter to his father. And for this help, he basically hired as a secretary a woman who herself was a Prague emigre named Esther Hoffe, and the two worked together for decades until Max Brod died in 1968, at which point he, in his will, said, I'm giving everything. He said, basically, I couldn't really pay you. He was not a man of means. By the way, he never made any money from his promotion and or editing of Kafka's material. And he says to Esther, he says, I couldn't really pay you an adequate salary for all those decades, but I would like to do one thing. I have no children myself, and I therefore bequeath you the most precious thing that I have, which is my estate, including the Kafka manuscripts. He dies in 1968, after which Esther Hoffe, who's living in an apartment in Spinoza Street,
which I would like to point out is right around the corner from me.
Right around the corner from you. And all these manuscripts she shares in this apartment in Spinoza Street with her daughters, Eva and Ruti Hoffe, and about a dozen cats. And she begins to do what she never dared to do during the lifetime of Max Brod. She begins to sell things. Most famously, in 1988, she goes to Sotheby's in London, and she sells the original manuscript of Kafka's great unfinished novel, The Trial. At the time, it gets something like $2 million on auction, the highest ever paid for a modern literary manuscript. The buyer is the Marbach Literary Archive in Germany. When she herself dies, Esther dies in 2007 at the age of 101. She then, in turn, in her will, gives her most precious possessions, the same manuscripts, or what was left of them after the sales, to her daughters, Eva and Ruti. That's where this story essentially begins in 2007 with her death, where the state of Israel steps in and objects to the probate of the will and says, no, you have no right to bequeath this material to your daughters. Instead, this material belongs at the National Library of Israel.
They had tried to do it before, after Max Brod died, and the court rejected the state's claim.
That's exactly right. It happened there was a first trial about this in the early 1970s. It didn't attract much attention, in part because Kafka was not quite as well known in Israeli literature and readership as he is today. And the court at that time ruled that Esther Hoffe has the right to do with these manuscripts as she wishes. That is why she could go to Sotheby's and sell this.
And that's why her daughters tried to get the same kind of ruling, right?
Precisely, yes.
Let me ask you about this. I think this is an interesting part of the story. big part of the book is about this octogenarian woman who she claims is not just a cat lady. She's sort of an anti-heroine, and it's not clear whether she is essentially trying to exploit the fact that she has come into possession of these manuscripts in order to make money and live on them, or I think you paint a sympathetic picture that she actually has a very deep emotional, familial connection to them. Which is it?
I really believe that it's the latter. She was painted in the popular press as being an eccentric cat lady. In fact, she was a cat lady, but she's also a very deeply sympathetic person. You have to remember that for her, Max Brod, the great friend of Kafka and the first biographer of Kafka, is a father figure for her. He helps to raise these two daughters. And for her, the story, I almost think of her as a character in a Kafka novel. Because she herself, in her self-presentation, understands herself as being a single solitary individual up against these great state powers, fighting almost as Joseph K. does in the trial for her own heritage against this sort of faceless bureaucracy. She never really fully grasped, I think, the legal machinations here, which adds to somehow the tragedy. And for her, it's a family story. She wants simply to inherit that which connects her most deeply, both to her mother and to this father figure, Max Brod, and I should add to her own past. She herself was born in Prague, had to flee with her parents at the age of 5. This is a great rupture in her life. So what I tried to do in this book is to follow these manuscripts almost as if they were a physical thread that connects the various characters. They connect Kafka to his best friend Max Brod. They connect the first half of Max Brod's life to the second, that is, the Prague half to the Tel Aviv half. And they connect Max Brod to his closest friend, Esther Holfe, and then, in turn, Esther to her daughters.
What are the legal implications here in terms of intellectual property about where, regardless of the national heritage aspect of it, whether it's in Israel or in Germany, it's really, that the state should have rights that supersede the personal rights of people to own what is legally theirs. Can you talk about the legal background to all this? What it means internationally in terms of Israeli local law, etc.?
The legal background is very simple. It's that Max Brod was a very prolific writer and published some 80 books in his life. When it came to his own will, however, he seems to have developed a case of ambiguity. Because he says two things in this will, which he wrote in the 1960s. On the one hand, I give you, Esther, rights to all of this material to do with as you wish. And on the other hand, I wish that before you, Esther, pass away, that you arrange for the deposit of this material in a proper archive, such as the National Library of Israel, the Tel Aviv Library, or another library here or abroad. Now, it's that latter clause that gets him into trouble, because essentially the state claims that if I give you a conditional bequest, right, and you in your lifetime fail to fulfill that condition, then that gift, being a conditional gift, reverts to a secondary inheritor. In Hebrew, it's called Yoresh Achar Yoresh. In this case, the secondary inheritor, so the National Library claims, is us, because we're the first institution mentioned in that clause of the will. That's the legal background.
Mm-hmm. Is Brod's ambiguity, in a way, sort of an interesting parallel or reflection to Kafka's own ambiguity about whether the material should ever continue to exist? You point out that even when he asked Max Brod to burn his material, it's not totally clear that he meant that.
It's not clear that he meant that for a very simple reason, which is that Max Brod, for the rest of his life, was quite defensive about that decision, as you might be. And he said as follows. He said, and there's no way of verifying this, but he said, in Kafka's lifetime, we've had several conversations about just this. And I told Kafka, in no uncertain terms, I will not be capable of doing this. Therefore, in my understanding, Kafka's genius extended to the fact that he asked or demanded for the fulfillment of his last instructions, the person who is precisely least capable of fulfilling them. So in a way, Kafka, I think, would have been very amused. He said, in these two instructions, yes, burn everything. On the other hand, he must have known that Brod would, if not face great difficulty, would not be able to carry this out.
I am fascinated by the relationship you portray between these two friends who, In a way, I feel like it's a relationship that belongs to a different era. Such close friends of such sort of intellectual depth. Maybe it belongs to a time when we didn't have so many distractions. But they also seem, I mean, for one thing, you portray them as not only not competitive, even though they were both writers, but extremely different. I mean, is that truth? There was no competition between them?
One of the great features of Max Brod, who hasn't been written about enough in English to my mind.
Which now I think is a shame after reading your book.
One of his features is, I really think, a very deep selflessness. He was a champion not only of Kafka, but of other more obscure figures. He also he was a musical man, he was a composer, he was a pianist. He helped essentially make the reputation of the Czech composer Janacek. And with regard to Kafka, he was in a difficult position during his lifetime. I think maybe you can imagine that you're in the same profession as someone else, okay?
I imagine it all the time. I think we all suffer.
And this other person that you're in, that is a colleague of yours, you know is a genius, and you also know that you're not a genius, although you may be extremely popular, although you
prolific.
And prolific, and you're getting the prizes, right? And Max Brod is unbelievably well connected. He's a networker, what we would today call a networker. I've seen some of the material now that's now in the National Library, okay? And his correspondence is a who's who of Central European intellectual life. He's
I would like
corresponding.
to point out that the book reads like the dinner party that I would like to go to.
He's corresponding with Thomas Mann. He's extremely close with Stefan Zweig. I saw a letter that Walter Benjamin wrote to him. I mean, he's
to mention Martin Buber.
And Martin Buber, of course. And so he's close to all these people, and he's promoting, and he's a networker. And in a sense, this is, to my mind, the great fascination of the relationship between these two men. First of all, they were of opposite temperaments, right? I mean, Kafka is not publishing. He's extremely hesitant to publish. He is extremely introverted. Max Brod is outgoing. He's extroverted. He has the opposite problem. He's publishing too much, perhaps. And he's a networker where Kafka is inward-looking, right? And maybe that's the secret of how the relationship worked.
And maybe the secret of Kafka's literary genius.
Yes, I think that's quite possible.
Do you think that Everhoffer's insistence, somewhat unreasonable insistence on keeping it alive, was in a way her fighting Brod's battle against Kafka that Brod himself never wanted to wage?
How do you mean?
There wasn't a rivalry between them, as you say, but maybe in Eva's head there was, and the fact that Kafka became this canonical figure and Brod was somewhat forgotten is something that you wanted to rectify.
I can tell you this. After a very long period, I finally was able to gain her trust, and I was able to speak with her both during the hearing, after the hearing, then after the verdict came down against her. And I can tell you this. She once told me we would sit at Café Dubnov, not far from where we are today.
How did you avoid all the politicians there?
And she told me once, Kafka has been like a curse to me. And I said, how do you mean? And she said, if it were up to me, you see, the problem was that Max Brod mixed his own estate with Kafka's. If it were up to me and if it were all separate, I would give away the Kafka material as long as I could have an uncomplicated inheritance of Max Brod. That's the one that she cared about. She cared about Max Brod. She had never met Kafka, right? I think that was her point of view.
But also, one of the experts that you quote in the book say that perhaps one of the reasons that Brod didn't get the exposure in scholarship that he should have done was the fact that his archives weren't accessible as other archives were. So maybe she was, in a way, shooting herself in the foot. What does it mean? The accessibility here, the pragmatic aspect of it is no less important than, the symbolic one.
We're going to get back to the symbolic stuff.
But that's exactly right. Just on the level of accessibility, I try to point out in the book that each of the three sides of this triangle made mistakes. In the case of the Hoffes, mother and daughter, the mistake was, just as you say, to keep all of this material in bank vaults in Switzerland, in Tel Aviv, and in this apartment with the cats in Spinoza Street. Now, all this time, they were not making this material available to scholars, sometimes very world-renowned scholars, who were dying to see it. I'll give you an example. Recently, over the last several years, there's been the definitive biography of Kafka by a German scholar named Rainer Stach. It's been published in 3 volumes by Princeton University Press, and he did not write these volumes chronologically. He wrote the volume on the early life of Kafka last. The reason being because he was waiting for this material in the Hoffe apartment to come to light, hoping against hope that it would come to light. Now, the material includes, for example, the diaries of Max Brod, some of which I've seen with my own hands, that date all the way back to 1917, that are going to promise to shed new light on this great friendship of these two men, which was so essential to Kafka's development. So this is the stuff that's going to come out. I want to say, by the way, that there are no unheralded or unseen Kafka masterpieces in this material, because Brod would have published them, just like he published the 3 unfinished novels. But what there is a tremendous treasure trove of Max Brod material that sheds light on not just on his own life, but on his friendship with Kafka.
I have to go back to that friendship because I find it so fascinating. I mean, despite, the fact that Brod was so committed to him so selflessly, there seems to have also been a dark side to it in a weird way, which is that Brod kind of extracts from Kafka more material. I mean, not just publishing his stuff, but helping him actually write it. And even when Kafka expresses in his own diaries or in his own communications that this is torment for him. What is the ethical background to that story, and can you explain a little bit more about it?
As you say, he was always pushing Kafka to write, to be more involved. Kafka would use Max Brod as his first audience. So let's say I'm Kafka and I'm reading something in draft. He would very often read it first to Max Brod, I'm sorry. In several cases, Max Brod reports that Kafka was reading something that today we would consider very a harrowing short story like The Penal Colony or something like this. And Kafka would break up laughing. He couldn't even finish his sentences as he was reading to Max Brod because he thought it was so funny. This is another feature of Kafka that Max Brod brings out in he was the first biographer of Kafka in 1937. He brings out the humor, not just the irony, but the humor in this man. He humanizes Kafka to us, I think. And that's what he sought to do for the rest of his life. There's a wonderful book by Milan Kundera called Testaments Betrayed. In this book, he questions this great decision of Max Brod to publish Kafka's material. And he says something interesting to me. He says, Brod could have burned everything or he could have saved everything as he did, but there was a third alternative, which is publish the fiction, but not the diaries, not the letter to his father, not the, as you say, the tormented personal aspects. Max Brod decided to do both. And I think that's a very interesting choice, right? Because in Max Brod's mind, and Max Brod was, I think, the greatest posthumous editor of the 20th century. He is, as Zadie Smith says, we today can only read Kafka broadly, B-O-R-D, in the sense that it's sometimes impossible to tell where Kafka ends and Max Brod begins. He's an interventionist editor. He's crossing out things, right?
But that's only to do with personal writings of Kafka, not to do with the published fiction? I mean,
also with the fiction. For example, in the great unfinished novel, The Trial, Kafka left it unnumbered. It's Max Brod who's confronting this manuscript, and I've seen it at Marbach now. And Kafka leaves it, for example, in unnumbered chapters. Well, who's deciding the order of the chapters? It's Max Brod. He's giving shape to this unfinished manuscript.
But then how can you ask him to burn your material? I know that happened after Kafka died, but I mean, if, as Brod portrays in his diaries, he's standing over Kafka telling him, you have to write this, even when Kafka says he wished it to the devil. I mean, he's helping bring this stuff into being to begin with. Could Kafka ever have believed that he would ever destroy his work, which in a way, as you portray it, seems almost a little bit partly Brod's?
Yes, I think that's right. I think there was collaboration, first of all, between the two of them in their lifetime. They started writing a novel together. They had a great idea to make money with a kind of cheap travel guide, travel Europe on the cheap kind of guide. They wrote things together. They wrote travel diaries together. And your question reminds me that I think, in a sense, we can say that Kafka was the greatest creation of Max Brod, but also maybe the reverse, that it was Kafka who made Brod what he is, which is an acknowledgement of the simple fact that most people today would never have heard of Max Brod were it not for his association with Kafka.
What can you tell us about his later life? He died in Tel Aviv in 1968, as you said. I mean, having published the works of this, sensational writer, and he remained to live here and, what was then and still is to an extent now a backwater country, so far away from the great literary capitals of the world. How did he see his role in all this? Was he really just, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, or?
Listen, I think he had a very difficult post-1939 life. part of that difficulty, on the one hand, his day job, if you will, was that he was the dramaturg of Habima Theater, the National Theater of Israel. He greatly expanded the repertory of Habima. I've been to the Habima archives. I've seen what he did. Let's say one of his jobs was, let's say you were an aspiring playwright, you wanted to have your play produced on stage at Habima. You would submit your play, and the first reader would be Max Brod. To this day, there's an archive of these little note cards that he wrote. One note card per play, where he's basically normally explaining why he's rejecting these plays, right?
Did he reject anybody that we really think is an important play right now?
I can't remember offhand, but he was rejecting 99% of the stuff. It was mostly crap. Why you're writing another play on a biblical theme? We've had enough of that. He really wanted to connect Habima to a more international...
I think it was just a yeke.
Yeah, and that. The second aspect of his life, of course, is that he is displaced. He's a German language writer living in Tel Aviv at a time when the German language and German culture more generally was, let's say, dismissed, was even suppressed, much in the way that Yiddish was in those years. Another example, in 1948, he wins perhaps the highest literary prize that Israel can confer, which is the Bialik Prize, for a novel that he wrote in German. As soon as the prize was announced, an uproar ensues in which the literary establishment of Tel Aviv says, how can we possibly grant the highest prize of the state, literary prize, to a novel written in German of all languages? And Max Brod was so hurt by this that in his own memoir, which he published in the 1960s, he doesn't even mention this episode. He almost erases it completely from his own memory. You can see that this is a man who's hurt, in a way, by the way in which he's precisely as unrecognized in Tel Aviv. It's almost the mirror image of his great acclaim that he had in Prague.
And isn't this part of the claim of the Marbach Library, Marbach archives in the court case, is that in general, Israel wasn't really that interested in Kafka to begin with at this point, and there's they present all sorts of evidence. Can you tell us about that? Is it true that Israel really didn't care much about Kafka?
The way I would put it is this: in the trial in the Supreme Court exposed two different kinds of latecoming to Kafka. Okay, the German lawyers were saying, and quite rightly, that you Israelis are latecomers to the Kafka industry at a time when Kafka was a sensation in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Italy. Kafka was hardly known in this country. It turns out that Kafka, and I try to do a little bit of this history in the book, was translated into Hebrew relatively late and relatively piecemeal. To this day, there's no complete edition of Kafka's works in Hebrew. If it were not for the personal intervention of the Shokin family, there would be even far less than there is today. And, you know, the Germans are saying during the court process, for example, every town in Germany has at least a Kafka Street or a Kafka Alley, and there's not a single Kafka Street in Israel or in Tel Aviv. There happens to be a Max Brod Street, by the way, but no Kafka Street. So that's one form of latecoming. You, the Israelis, are complete latecomers to this. You only became interested now in the last few years. On the other hand, there's a symmetry of latecoming when it comes to the Germans, which is that, yes, they were reading Kafka, they were putting together critical editions and everything after the war, but they were latecomers to acknowledging and fully reckoning with Kafka's Jewishness. They simply had no tools to understand Kafka's Jewishness. You know that Kafka had some premonition, I think, of the contrary ways that he would be claimed. And he writes in a letter to his fiancée, Felice Bauer, he says, 2 recent articles have mentioned my work. One of them by Max Brod says that Kafka's narrative art is quintessentially Jewish. Another article in some other journal says that Kafka's fiction is quintessentially German. Which am I? He says with a wink to Felice Bauer. And he answers his own question. He says, am I then a circus rider straddling 2 horses? No, I'm not even that. I lie prostrate on the ground between these 2 horses. In other words, he himself, and that's one of the great ironies of the case, is that we're not just talking about any writer. We're talking about a writer who himself refused to be claimed. He never really lived in Germany.
And his entire life was defined by an identity struggle.
Yes, and he refused to be claimed by Zionism. He refused to be claimed by the Jewish tradition, on the one hand. He also refused to be claimed by the German tradition. After all, he barely lived in Germany. Of course, his language was German, but he was living in Prague in been a kind of outpost of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? He considered himself to be a part of the Jewish minority, of the German-speaking minority, of the Czech minority of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
I'd like to take it again from the symbolic aspect to the more practical one, if I may.
I'm still going to go back to the symbolic stuff after that. It won't help you.
Talk again about the question of accessibility, because, I mean, one of the most powerful arguments that were made for its relocation to Germany is that it has to be all centered in one place where the biggest experts are and can have access to it. You give examples of other archives that were dispersed around the world. You know, Yehuda Michai's archive that was controversially sold to Yale University, I think it was, and is now in the United States, and Stefan Zweig's article that's scattered across 3 or 4 continents. I mean, isn't that really the prime argument here, that it has to be all in one place, taken care of by the biggest experts, and, you know, you just have to go to one place to study Kafka from A to Z?
Sure. I should also say, on a practical level, that much of the Kafka material that we have today is at the Bodleian in Oxford. And that has to do with the simple reason that Kafka's 3 sisters were killed in the Shoah. This also came up in the Supreme Court hearing, by the way, where the Shoah was hovering like a dark cloud over the proceedings, and where the Israelis would say, Germany is precisely the last place that Kafka's heritage should be guarded. Look how well you guarded his own family. But one of his nieces survived. Her name was Mariana Steiner. She went to London, and at a certain point in 1952, Max Brod says, you know, some of this material belongs to you as the executor of the Kafka estate, and through a long process, basically, that material got to the Bodleian, which was not part of this trial, of course.
Why were they not suing to say we want the whole archive to be together? We've got so much of it. Why did they not jump in?
Well, because essentially the part that they already had, quite legally, was uncontested by this trial. So it was not touched by this trial. But as you say, between the German archive and the National Library, it's clear that the German archive in Marbach is world-class. It has the expertise in a way that the National Library in Jerusalem does not. I think that's a legitimate claim. On the other hand, let me tell you about a conversation that I had when I interviewed the director of the Marbach archive. And we were speaking about exactly this. I said to him, you know that if you read the verdict, it mandates that the National Library must digitize the collection after some time. And I said to him, you know, why does it matter in the age of digitization where the physical copies of these manuscripts physically or geographically reside? And he says something interesting. His name is Dr. Ralph. And he says to me, in this case, it does matter because sometimes the physical location of an estate will help determine or shape the way it's interpreted. How so? And this has really astonished me. He said, basically, if the Kafka and Brod material ends up in Jerusalem, then Kafka will be read in the narrowest sense as only a Jewish writer. If, however, the Kafka material ends up joining the rest of the Kafka material in Marbach, in Germany, then Kafka will be read in the most universal sense. And I couldn't help thinking to myself, that's an astonishing thing to say a blink of an eye after the Second World War, that somehow Germany, or at least the German intellectual elite, sees itself as the guardian of kind of universal literature as such. And the Israelis are the sort of narrow grasping ones. And it's almost like the reading between the lines of that conversation, it's almost like he really believed that we Germans don't have interests besides the interests of protecting literature as such. The Israelis, the Jews, they are the ones who have interests.
Well, I guess clearly he was seeing himself as the head of Germany as such a critical figure in the EU.
But do you think that the fact that it was decided in an Israeli court skewed the course of the saga in the way that it went?
I can tell you from the German perspective, yes, they made exactly that point, including in the German press.
Do you think they have a point?
No, I don't think they have a point. I mean, the German claim, one of the German claims, was that it's not really fair that one arm, if you will, of the Israeli government, namely the Supreme Court, is judging in favor of another arm, state arm, namely the National Library of Israel. In my opinion, and having sat in that court and having interviewed Eliakim Rubinstein, who was presiding over that particular hearing, I think that the case was decided on its merits. And I'm no judicial scholar, of course, but that's my own opinion, that there is a judicial autonomy that did play a role here.
But back to the symbolic element, I still want to explore one of the potential cases that could be made for the German ownership in Marbach, and not necessarily a legal case, but in a historic collective memory kind of way. Is there any value, can you acknowledge, not as a lawyer, as a literary person, any sort of value to a country saying, this was part of our history? This was part of the worst parts of our history. I mean, Kafka himself wasn't a victim, but his family was, the Jewish people were. It's important for us to have this archive so that we remember who we once were before we committed this egregious act. Is that of any value as well?
Yeah, and that's why I was so fascinated in this case, because I felt that it wasn't just a case about one particular writer. It was a case that brought to head these two countries, each of which was trying to overcome its own past. Each of which had a relation to its own past, and that relation became very relevant to this case. In the Israeli case, it was, of course, the relation to our own diaspora. There was a very interesting, again, unspoken but operative assumption here, which is that Jerusalem now sees itself, unlike in, let's say, the 40s and 50s, now sees itself as the culmination of the Jewish story. Even if that story of Jewish culture happened to have taken place in the diaspora, somehow the proper culmination or end of that story is Jerusalem. Why else would a writer who died in 1924 have his proper place in Jerusalem? I think that's a very interesting assumption about how Jerusalem sees itself as a kind of gravitational center, not just of the ingathering of exiles in the sense of people and refugees, but as the ingathering of cultural heritage. You mentioned Yehuda Amichai. I think the National Library recognized that it made a terrible mistake. I mean, who would belong in Jerusalem if not the archive of Yehuda Amichai, the Jerusalem poet? In this case, though, I think maybe they've learned their lesson or they've recalibrated themselves, and the recalibration involves a recalibration to diaspora culture. In the case of the Germans, to answer the second part of your question, it's an overcoming of the past precisely because Kafka was a Jewish pre-war writer, and precisely because he was writing in German, we can allow or we can use that as one of the ways in which we overcome our guilt, our Holocaust guilt. Look, it's almost as if we can say, look, we have a Jewish writer who was part and parcel of the German modernist tradition, and he was a Jew.
Well, I was going to say the opposite. We should realize who this community was. You know, they gave us some of the world's best writers, and we have to reckon with what we did by destroying them. I mean, maybe that's a wishful thinking, that they would take it in that sense.
No, I think that's also part of it, yeah.
At what point did you realize that these are really the materials the story is made of? I mean, it had been going on for a long time before the ruling was finally handed. At what time did you say, okay, this is a fascinating story, I want to write a book about it?
It happened in three different instances. I first came to the story when, in the winter of 2010, I did a German-Israeli journalist exchange program. It's called the Ernst Kramer program, and I ended up in the culture pages of Die Zeit, the weekly based in Hamburg, and already then, the people on the culture pages there, the German colleagues, were already speaking of this case. Although it was not yet at the Supreme Court level, it was working its way up. And I thought, okay, that sort of got my attention. Then in 2011, I began to teach at this Bard College Al-Quds University program, and I began to teach The Trial as one of our central texts, Kafka's novel, The Trial. And that really, it's another story that we can talk about perhaps some other time. But that experience of teaching this particular novel to Palestinian students who wrote incredible things. They had, for the most part, never heard of Kafka. For them, the Jewishness of Kafka was completely irrelevant. By the way, Kafka never mentions the word Jew once in his fiction. And they related to their own stories, in some cases of fighting to keep their homes in the old city of Jerusalem through the vocabulary that they were learning from Joseph K. in Kafka's novel.
I think it's hard not to overuse the word Kafka-esque when describing Israel's military regime.
Precisely. And then it really clicked when I began to sit with Eva Hofe. I mentioned to you just before the program began that the great tragedy, to my mind, is that Eva Hofe died as a dispossessed woman, essentially in August of 2018, after her defeat. If I were writing a novel and not a nonfiction book, I would have ended with her going back to her apartment on Spinoza Street after being defeated, after the verdict came against her, and burning everything in that apartment as a kind of auto-da-fe, as a kind of statement to say, if I can't have it, no one will, but also in a strange, bizarre way to go back to the origin of the story in 1924 and to fulfill Kafka's will from 90 years earlier.
That would have been like a Hanoch Levin play.
Yeah,
Too bad he's not around to write it.
Or something more sinister than that. Benjamin Balint, the author of Kafka's Last Trial, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a Kafka-esque pleasure. And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. And now we'd like to ask you this. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to consider writing us a review. It helps us reach more people. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews in it, and if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and do not forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.